The winding road skirting the shores of Lake Tahoe was eerily deserted, except for the unmistakable growl of a bright red Mustang Shelby GT 500 slicing through the night under the silver glow of the moon. The car, a marvel of American engineering, gleamed as the city lights flickered across its sleek body, a fleeting streak of brilliance against the encroaching darkness. Ahead, a roadside billboard bore an enigmatic message. Sometimes the soul must stumble through shadows to find where the light truly resides. Behind the wheel was Nathaniel "Nate" Sawyer, 36 years old, heir to one of the most prestigious collections of vintage muscle cars in the country. He was also the CEO of a chain of elite restoration shops, specializing in breathing new life into automotive legends. Tonight, however, he wasn't the poised businessman the world knew. The alcohol coursing through his veins dulled his senses, his thoughts blurring into the alcohol-infused haze. In his mind, one name echoed louder than the purr of the engine: Celeste. She was supposed to be with him tonight, sharing the milestone he'd meticulously planned. He'd chosen an exclusive restaurant in Reno, booked the finest table weeks in advance, and nestled in his jacket pocket was a diamond ring, an emblem of the new chapter he was ready to embark on with her. But just as the sommelier presented the first bottle of their pre-selected wine, his phone buzzed with a text that shattered his anticipation. "Nate, I'm so sorry, but I can't make it tonight. My stylist had a last-minute opening, and tomorrow's gala is too important. I have to look flawless. Let's talk tomorrow, okay?" "The stylist?" Nate muttered bitterly, the words tasting as sour as the Cabernet he had yet to sip. Celeste's shallow excuse clanged in his ears. Disillusioned, he abandoned the restaurant and found solace in a secluded lounge downtown. With an overpriced bourbon in hand, he nursed his heartbreak. By the time he reached his third glass, he gestured to the bartender, a man with gray at his temples and wisdom in his eyes. "I had it all planned," Nate confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything was perfect. Tonight, I was going to ask her to marry me, and she didn't even bother to show up." The bartender, polishing a glass with deliberate care, met his gaze. "Son," he said gently, "sometimes not getting what you think you want can be life's greatest blessing." Those words lingered as Nate left the bar, his steps unsteady but purposeful. Back in the driver's seat, the Mustang roared to life, its engine a stark contrast to the turmoil in his chest. The powerful headlights pierced the shadows of the twisting road ahead. Then, in an instant, they illuminated a graceful silhouette, a deer crossing the pavement with calm indifference. Startled, Nate yanked the wheel, the tires screeching against the asphalt as the car fish-tailed. It came to an abrupt halt with a crunch, smoke curling faintly from under the hood. A warning light blinked on the dashboard. The cooling system had failed. The Mustang's safety mechanisms kicked in, and the engine cut off, leaving Nate stranded under the vast expanse of the starlit sky. "Damn it!" he hissed, slumping back against the leather seat. A mixture of frustration and despair welled within him as he fumbled for his phone. His first instinct was to call Celeste. Her number rang once, twice, and then voicemail. "Figures," he muttered bitterly. "Priorities, right? Gotta love a stylist emergency." Desperate and out of options, he scrolled through his contacts until his finger hesitated over a familiar name. Against his better judgment, he hit dial. After a few rings, a soft voice answered, hesitant yet unmistakably kind. "Hello? This is the Sawyer residence." "Celeste. Thank God," Nate murmured, his voice thick with exhaustion. "I'm stranded out on the old road near Emerald Bay. Can you come get me, please?" A pause hung on the line, followed by a quiet intake of breath. On the other end was not Celeste, but Sophie Rivera, a 25-year-old housekeeper who had worked at the Sawyer estate for 2 years. She was an immigrant from Mexico, soft-spoken and diligent, with a resilience forged in the fire of hardship. Hearing Nate's broken plea stirred something deep within her, a mixture of compassion and a quiet yearning she didn't dare admit, not even to herself. "Nate," she began, her voice faltering, But the ache in his words silenced her protests. If he thought she was Celeste, could she let him down now? "Where exactly are you?" she asked, her resolve hardening with every syllable. "Emerald Bay Road, near the lookout point," he slurred, his words heavy with alcohol. Please hurry." Sophie hesitated for only a moment before nodding, though he couldn't see it. "I'll be there as soon as I can," she assured him, her voice steady, despite the storm raging in her chest. "You're the best," he mumbled. "Knew you wouldn't let me down." Hearing the gratitude in his tone, Sophie felt her heart twist. "I'll see you soon, Nate," she replied, before ending the call. Clad in a dark shawl and clutching her phone, Sophie flagged down a cab. The driver, sensing her urgency, didn't question her as she gave the directions. As the car sped down the quiet roads, she stared out the window, wrestling with the decision she'd made. Sometimes the heart leads us to places logic would never dare. The taxi approached the desolate stretch of road, the Mustang visible under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. A faint wisp of smoke rose from its hood, curling toward the sky like a silent distress signal. Sophie stepped out, her shawl tightly wrapped around her shoulders as the crisp night air bit at her skin. Her breath clouded in front of her as she cautiously approached the car. "Nate?" she called softly, her voice carrying over the quiet hum of the forest. The driver's side door creaked open, and Nate stumbled out, his tall frame swaying unsteadily. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled from the night's events. Despite the dim light, his tired eyes lit up with relief when they landed on her. "Celeste," he murmured, his voice a mix of disbelief and gratitude. "You came." Before Sophie could correct him, he wrapped her in an unsteady embrace, his warmth seeping through the thin barrier of her shawl. Her breath hitched, caught off guard by the sudden closeness, but she steadied herself, her hands resting awkwardly on his back. "I was worried," he mumbled, his words slurring slightly. "Thought you'd leave me here to rot." Her heart raced, a swirl of emotions she couldn't quite untangle. "I'd never do that," she whispered, her voice trembling as she stepped back gently, trying to maintain her composure. "Let's get you out of here." Nate nodded, leaning heavily against the car as he surveyed the damage. "The Mustang's done for," he muttered, his tone bitter. "She overheated, just like everything else in my life." Sophie glanced at the car, then back at Nate. "Let me see what I can do," she said, her voice firmer now. Without waiting for his response, she moved to the hood, her fingers searching for the release latch. Nate blinked at her in confusion. "What are you doing?" he asked, his tone laced with disbelief. "You're not exactly dressed for a pit stop, Celeste." She smiled faintly, more to herself than to him. "You'd be surprised what I know," she replied, her words carrying a quiet confidence. As the hood popped open, she leaned over, her hands finding the loose hose almost instinctively. Memories of her father teaching her the basics of engine repair in their modest garage years ago came rushing back. "Check the coolant line," she murmured to herself, tightening the clamp on the hose. Her hands worked deftly, despite the chill numbing her fingers. After a few moments, she straightened up and wiped her hands on her shawl. "Try starting it now," she said, stepping back. Nate stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something softer. Admiration, perhaps. "Are you serious?" "Go ahead," she urged, gesturing to the driver's seat. He shrugged, climbing back into the car and turning the key. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. For a moment, silence hung between them, the low purr of the Mustang filling the air. "How?" Nate began, stepping out of the car again, his eyes locked onto hers, searching for answers. "You're full of surprises tonight, Celeste." Sophie felt a flush rise to her cheeks, but quickly turned away, pulling her shawl tighter. "Let's just get you home," she said softly, her tone gentle but firm. He chuckled, a low, almost rueful sound. "Fair enough," he said, his gaze lingering on her for a beat longer than necessary. "You're driving." She hesitated, but his insistence left no room for argument. "All right," she relented, sliding into the driver's seat. Adjusting the mirrors and gripping the wheel with steady hands, she took a deep breath, recalling her father's words, "Drive with focus and let the road guide you." Nate settled into the passenger seat, his head leaning back against the rest as his eyes began to droop. The effects of the alcohol and the emotional toll of the night were catching up to him. As the car rolled smoothly down the winding road, his voice broke the silence. "Celeste," he murmured, his tone softer now, almost vulnerable. "Thank you for being here. I don't know what I'd do without you." Sophie swallowed hard, her grip on the wheel tightening. She wanted to correct him, to tell him the truth, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she focused on the road ahead, the faint outlines of trees rushing past in the moonlight. When she finally glanced at him, he was asleep, his features softened by the gentle pull of slumber. In that moment, he looked so different from the confident, composed man she'd observed from afar. He seemed almost peaceful. The drive back to Nate's estate felt like an eternity, and yet not nearly long enough. Sophie's thoughts spiraled as the road unwound ahead, illuminated by the Mustang's headlights. She couldn't stop replaying the events of the night, his words, his touch, the way he'd looked at her, even if he thought she was someone else. Each moment left a mark, one she wasn't sure she could erase. By the time they arrived at the Grand Sawyer estate, the first streaks of dawn were breaking over the horizon. The sprawling property loomed in the soft light, its towering facade bathed in hues of gold and pink. Sophie parked carefully near the front steps and exhaled slowly, as though releasing the tension of the entire night. She turned toward Nate, still slumped in the passenger seat, his breathing slow and even. For a moment she simply watched him, her chest tightening. She couldn't deny it any longer. This man, despite his flaws and the impossibility of the situation, had stirred something within her, something she didn't dare name. Shaking herself from her thoughts, she reached out and gently touched his shoulder. "Nate," she whispered, "we're home." He stirred, his eyes fluttering open, glazed with the remnants of sleep. Blinking, he looked around, his gaze eventually landing on her. For a brief second his expression softened in a way that made her heart ache. "You're amazing, you know that?" he murmured, his voice thick with fatigue. "I don't deserve you." Sophie's throat tightened. "Come on," she said gently, avoiding his gaze. "Let's get you inside." She exited the car and moved to his side, helping him out as he struggled to find his balance. He leaned on her heavily, his arm draped over her shoulders as they made their way up the steps. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of his weight, but because of the reality of what she was doing, leading him back to a life she didn't belong in. Once inside, the grand foyer enveloped them in silence, broken only by the soft echo of their footsteps. Sophie guided him toward the staircase, but his steps faltered, and he leaned against the banister, turning to look at her. "You're different tonight," he said, his eyes searching hers. "I don't know what it is, but you feel more real, more you." Sophie's breath hitched, panic bubbling under the surface. She forced a smile, her voice barely steady. "You've had a long night, Nate. Let's get you upstairs." He nodded faintly, allowing her to lead him again. When they reached his bedroom, she helped him sit on the edge of the massive bed. He looked up at her with a hazy, almost wistful expression, his hand reaching out to catch hers. "Stay," he said softly, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "Just for a while." Her heart felt as though it might shatter. She knew she should leave, knew this wasn't her place, but the weight of his gaze and the vulnerability in his voice rooted her to the spot. "I can't," she whispered, pulling her hand away gently. "You need to rest." He smiled faintly, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "You're probably right," he murmured, lying back on the bed. As his eyes drifted closed, he spoke one last time. "Thank you, Celeste." Sophie stood frozen, her emotions warring within her. The man she'd quietly admired for so long had finally seen her, but not as herself. The truth of that burned deeper than she expected. She turned and slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. As she descended the stairs, the enormity of the night weighed on her. By the time she stepped outside, the sun had fully risen, casting the estate in a warm, golden light. She called for another cab, her hands trembling slightly as she pressed the phone to her ear. When the cab arrived, Sophie climbed in, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She stared out the window as the estate faded into the distance, her thoughts a tangled web of regret, longing, and confusion. "This is your world now, Sophie," she told herself. "Keep your head down. Don't dream about what can never be." But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Back at the small guest house nestled behind the Sawyer estate, her humble home for the past 2 years, Sophie slipped inside as quietly as possible. The other staff would be waking soon, bustling about with the morning's routines. She didn't want to be noticed, not yet. The weight of the night still pressed on her, a secret too raw to share. Standing in front of her modest vanity, Sophie caught sight of her reflection. The person staring back at her looked like a stranger, flushed cheeks, disheveled hair, and eyes shimmering with emotions she didn't dare name. Her shawl still carried the faint scent of engine oil, a small reminder of the surreal night she'd just lived. "What have I done?" she thought, gripping the edge of the vanity as if it could anchor her to reality. A memory surfaced, Nate's hand resting on hers, his eyes filled with gratitude, and something else, something deeper. The intensity of it had sent her heart spiraling into uncharted territory. She shook her head, trying to dispel the thought. There was no room for fantasies in her world. Nate belonged to Celeste, a woman of privilege and poise, who walked in circles Sophie couldn't even dream of entering. What had happened last night, however unintended, was a fleeting moment born of confusion, nothing more. But the ache in her chest argued otherwise. Sophie straightened, pulling herself together. She changed quickly, donning her maid's uniform and tucking her hair into a neat bun beneath her cap. The day had begun, and she had responsibilities to fulfill. She couldn't afford to dwell on what could never be. In the main house, sunlight streamed through the grand windows of the living room, illuminating the luxurious space with its plush furnishings and gilded decor. Sophie carried a silver tray with Celeste's morning coffee, her steps measured and careful. She was on edge, unsure of how to face the woman whose life she'd inadvertently stepped into for a single, stolen night. Entering the living room, Sophie's breath caught. Celeste sat elegantly on the couch, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her cream-colored robe draped casually over her shoulders. She exuded effortless grace, scrolling through her phone with an air of mild disinterest. But it wasn't Celeste's presence that made Sophie falter. Nate was there too, seated in an armchair across from her. He was dressed down in a plain gray sweater and jeans, his hair still slightly mussed from sleep. His expression was distant, but his eyes sharpened the moment they landed on Sophie. She froze, her pulse quickening. His gaze lingered, as if trying to unravel something just beyond his reach. Sophie quickly averted her eyes, focusing on placing the coffee tray on the marble table in front of Celeste. "Good morning, Miss Celeste," Sophie said, keeping her voice steady. "Your coffee?" Celeste barely glanced up. "Thank you," she said curtly, her attention still fixed on her phone. Sophie began to retreat, eager to escape the room, but Celeste's voice stopped her. "Oh, Sophie," she said casually, setting her phone down. "I noticed my car wasn't in the driveway this morning. Did you move it for some reason?" Sophie stiffened, panic rising. She turned slowly, her hands clasped in front of her. "No, ma'am," she replied carefully. "I didn't touch it." Celeste frowned, her brow furrowing slightly. "Strange," she mused, more to herself than to Sophie. I could have sworn I parked it closer to the front. Sophie glanced at Nate, who was watching her intently. His expression was unreadable, his sharp gaze pinning her in place. For a moment she wondered if he remembered anything, if the hazy pieces of last night had started to come together in his mind. Perhaps someone moved it to make room for deliveries, Sophie offered quickly, her voice calm despite the turmoil inside. I can check with the staff if you'd like. Celeste waved a dismissive hand. Never mind, it's not important. She picked up her coffee, taking a delicate sip before returning her attention to her phone. Sophie gave a small nod and turned to leave, her steps brisk but controlled. She could feel Nate's eyes on her as she exited the room, the intensity of his gaze like a weight she couldn't shake. Later that afternoon, Sophie found herself in the estate's expansive garden, trimming the hedges near the rose bushes. The repetitive task gave her a sense of peace, her hands busy while her mind wrestled with the events of the past 24 hours. She'd almost managed to lose herself in the rhythm of her work when a voice startled her. "Sophie?" She turned abruptly, the shears trembling slightly in her hands. Nate stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across his face. "Mr. Sawyer," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "is there something you need?" He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "I wanted to thank you," he said simply. "For last night." Her heart stuttered. She forced herself to meet his eyes, searching for any sign that he remembered more than he let on. "I just did what anyone would do," she said softly, her hands tightening around the shears. "No," he said firmly, shaking his head. "You didn't. You went out of your way to help me, and I'm grateful." She hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The sincerity in his voice was disarming, and the way he looked at her, like he truly saw her, made her chest ache. "It was nothing," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer still, his presence overwhelming. For a moment he seemed like he wanted to say more, but then he hesitated, as if the words caught in his throat. "Thank you," he repeated, his voice softer this time. With that he turned and walked away, leaving Sophie standing amidst the roses, her heart pounding in her chest. As she watched him go, one thought echoed in her mind. What happens now? The next few days at the Sawyer estate unfolded in an almost surreal calm. Sophie went about her duties with mechanical precision, her mind constantly replaying every detail of that fateful night. She kept her head down, avoiding unnecessary interactions with both Celeste and Nate. Yet, no matter how hard she tried to blend into the background, she couldn't escape the subtle tension that seemed to hang in the air whenever Nate was nearby. It was during a quiet afternoon that the balance finally tipped. Sophie was in the grand dining room, polishing the antique silverware that adorned the long mahogany table. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows reflected off the gleaming utensils, casting shimmering patterns on the walls. She was so focused on her task that she didn't notice Nate enter the room until he spoke. "You always seem to be working." His voice startled her, and she nearly dropped the spoon she was polishing. Straightening, she turned to face him, her composure quickly falling into place. "There is always something to be done," she replied, her tone polite but guarded. Nate leaned casually against the doorway, his arms crossed. He wasn't wearing the polished suits she was accustomed to seeing him in. Instead, he had on a simple navy sweater and jeans, which somehow made him seem more approachable and more dangerous to her fraying composure. "Do you ever stop to take a breath?" he asked, his tone lighter this time, almost teasing. She hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I find peace in keeping busy," she said finally, returning her attention to the silverware. For a moment he didn't reply. The silence stretched between them, charged and heavy. Sophie felt his gaze on her, sharp and searching, as though he were trying to unravel a puzzle. "About the other night," he said suddenly, his voice low and serious. Her hand froze mid-polish. Slowly, she set the spoon down, her heart thundering in her chest. "What about it?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I've been trying to piece it all together," he admitted, stepping further into the room. "It's all so blurry, but I remember things, bits and pieces." He paused, his brows knitting together as though he were searching for the right words. "I remember feeling safe, like someone really cared." Sophie's breath caught. She clenched her hands in front of her, willing herself to stay calm. "I'm glad you felt that way," she said softly, keeping her eyes on the table. "You needed someone that night." He took another step closer, the sound of his footsteps echoing faintly in the vast room. "But it doesn't make sense," he continued, his tone insistent. "Celeste doesn't—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening as if he didn't want to finish the thought. Sophie finally looked up, meeting his gaze. "Maybe that's a question you should ask her," she said gently, though her chest ached at the thought. "She cares for you in her own way." His eyes searched hers, frustration flickering across his face. "But it wasn't her," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie's pulse raced as she struggled to find the right response. "Mr. Sawyer? Nate?" he interrupted, his voice firm. "Call me Nate." Her mouth went dry. She swallowed hard, her hands twisting in front of her. "Nate," she said hesitantly, "I think you're reading too much into this." "Am I?" he asked, stepping closer still. "Because I've been thinking about it nonstop, and something doesn't add up." His gaze bore into her, intense and unyielding. "You were there, weren't you?" Sophie felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. She took a step back, shaking her head. "You were upset. You'd had too much to drink. It's natural for things to be unclear." "Stop," he said quietly but firmly, cutting her off. "Just tell me the truth." Her breath hitched. She wanted to deny it, to protect the fragile boundaries she'd built between them, but the look in his eyes made it impossible. He wasn't just searching for answers, he was searching for her. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It was me." The admission hung in the air like a fragile thread ready to snap at any moment. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Nate's expression shifted from confusion to something unreadable, his brow furrowing as he processed her words. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do that?" Sophie's throat tightened, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Because you needed someone," she said, her voice breaking. "You were alone, and I couldn't just leave you there. I know it wasn't my place, but I couldn't. I couldn't walk away." His gaze softened, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. He took a step closer, closing the distance between them. "You didn't have to," he said quietly. "But you did." Sophie looked away, tears pricking at her eyes. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice trembling. "You thought I was someone else. That's all that matters." "No," he said firmly, his hand reaching out to gently tilt her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. "What matters is that you were there when no one else was." Her breath caught as she searched his eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. In that moment she saw something she'd never dared to hope for. A glimmer of recognition, of something real. But before either of them could speak, the sound of heels clicking against the marble floor shattered the moment. Sophie stepped back quickly, her heart racing as Celeste entered the room, her expression sharp and curious. "There you are," Celeste said, her eyes flicking between them. "What's going on?" Sophie dropped her gaze, her hands clenching at her sides. "Nothing, ma'am," she said quickly. "I was just finishing the polishing." Nate's jaw tightened, but he didn't contradict her. "Just talking," he said simply, his tone neutral. Celeste raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "Well, don't linger too long," she said, her voice clipped. "We have guests arriving for dinner tonight, and everything needs to be perfect." "Yes, ma'am," Sophie murmured, her voice barely audible. As Celeste turned and strode out of the room, Sophie risked a glance at Nate. His expression was guarded now, his gaze lingering on her for a moment, before he turned and followed Celeste out. Left alone in the vast, empty room, Sophie felt the weight of everything crash down around her. She placed her hands on the table to steady herself, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain. The truth had changed everything. "If you have nothing important to say, fetch another cup immediately," snapped Celeste, her tone sharp and disdainful. "Can't you see my fiancé is here? I don't have time for a maid's nonsense." The air between them grew unbearably tense, a silence that cut sharper than any reprimand. Celeste turned back to Nate, her lips curling into a saccharine smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Darling," she cooed, her voice dripping with feigned sweetness, "you know how much I despise interruptions like these. Isn't it frustrating when the staff doesn't understand their place? Not everyone shares our standards, do they?" Her words were a pointed reminder of Sophie's position, a cruel jab at the invisible divide between them. Sophie's heart sank as her gaze dropped to the floor. She carefully placed the tray on the table, her hands steady despite the storm raging inside her. As she stepped back, a sudden memory of her father's words from years ago surfaced in her mind. "Every humble step forward is a path to greatness no one can take away." She clung to those words like a lifeline, retreating quietly, her face a mask of calm even as the sting of humiliation threatened to break her composure. Behind her she felt Nate's eyes following her, an unspoken tension lacing his gaze as though he were trying to unravel the emotions she so carefully concealed. The silence in the room became almost oppressive, broken only by the faint clink of porcelain as Nate lifted his coffee cup. He leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable as he fixed Celeste with a look that carried an unusual weight. "Celeste," he said evenly, his tone firm but controlled. "You could treat her with a little more respect. That tone, it's unnecessary. She's clearly doing her job well, and you didn't even give her a chance to speak." Celeste's eyes widened, her surprise quickly morphing into a brittle laugh. She tilted her head, her gaze sharpening as she studied him. "Darling," she began, her voice deceptively soft, "why waste energy debating something as trivial as the staff? Everyone plays their role in life. Isn't that how the world works? Surely it's not worth arguing over this." Nate's expression shifted, the warmth draining from his eyes. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low and deliberate. "Roles can change, Celeste, and maybe that's exactly why it's worth remembering that greatness doesn't come from holding others down. It comes from lifting them up." For the first time, Celeste's polished demeanor faltered. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her composure cracking as a flicker of unease crossed her face. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension stretching between them like a taut string, ready to snap. "I really don't understand why you're fixated on this," she replied, her tone clipped and defensive. "She's just a maid, Nate. She has her place, and we have ours. That's how things are." Her words hung in the air, their cold finality jarring against the warmth of Nate's earlier sentiment. He didn't respond immediately, his gaze drifting to the doorway where Sophie had disappeared. A strange hollowness settled in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite articulate. The memory of the night by the lake resurfaced, moments of quiet connection, of vulnerability, of something genuine he hadn't realized he craved until it was gone. Lifting his coffee cup again, Nate inhaled deeply, and there it was, a subtle, familiar fragrance, jasmine and bergamot, weaving through the rich aroma of the coffee. It was delicate yet distinct, and it transported him back to that roadside, under the silver moonlight. The fragments of the night came rushing back, the warmth of a hand, the gentle reassurance of a voice, the softness of a kiss. He closed his eyes, the scent pulling him deeper into the memory. For a fleeting moment, the bustling mansion and its finely curated perfection faded away, replaced by the raw simplicity of that night. The connection he had felt then was as real as the air he breathed now, and it wasn't Celeste. "Have you switched perfumes recently?" he asked suddenly, his voice measured, his gaze steady. Celeste blinked, startled by the unexpected question. Then she laughed lightly, a touch of vanity gleaming in her eyes. "Of course! You noticed, didn't you?" she said, her tone triumphant. "It's a new line of Chanel, an exclusive version naturally. I knew you'd appreciate the upgrade." She laughed again, clearly pleased with herself, while Nate's eyes drifted toward the doorway once more. As if on cue, Sophie reappeared, carrying the missing coffee cup. She moved cautiously, her eyes downcast as she approached the table, and placed the cup delicately on the tray. The same fragrance, jasmine and bergamot, seemed to intensify in the air, and Nate's chest tightened with certainty. His eyes followed her every movement, and for a moment the world slowed. Her careful, unassuming presence contrasted starkly with Celeste's flamboyance. There was no pretense, no mask, only an honest, quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her. "Thank you," Nate said, his voice warm and deliberate, his gaze fixed on Sophie. She froze momentarily, her breath catching as she risked a brief glance at him. "You're welcome," she murmured, her voice barely audible, before retreating toward the door. Her heart pounded as she felt his eyes linger, the weight of his attention almost too much to bear. "Sophie," Nate called softly just as she reached the doorway. She turned slowly, her hand resting on the frame, her expression guarded but curious. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone laced with something she couldn't quite place. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition. Sophie hesitated, her mind racing. "Sophie," she replied quietly, her voice trembling slightly as their eyes met. The sound of her name seemed to strike a chord within him, as if the final piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. His chest tightened, a realization blooming in the back of his mind. It's her. She was the one. Celeste scoffed, her voice slicing through the charged moment. "Does it really matter what her name is?" she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "She's just a maid. They come and go. None of this changes anything." Her words, sharp and dismissive, hung in the air, but Nate didn't respond immediately. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on Sophie, who stood frozen in the doorway, her fingers gripping the frame as if for support. Her cheeks flushed, and she quickly cast her eyes downward, her posture retreating further into herself. Nate's jaw tightened. The sting of Celeste's words struck a chord he hadn't felt before, an awareness of the stark differences between the two women standing before him. One clung to status and appearance, while the other exuded a quiet dignity that resonated deeply with him. Finally, he turned back to Celeste, his expression unreadable. "Everyone matters, Celeste," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Even those you consider insignificant." Celeste's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a tight smile. "Of course, darling," she said dismissively, waving a manicured hand. "But let's not turn this into a philosophical debate. It's hardly worth the energy." Nate didn't respond, his focus already shifting back to Sophie, who had started to retreat from the room. He called out again, his tone soft yet commanding. "Sophie, wait." She hesitated, her breath catching as she stopped in her tracks. Slowly she turned, her wide eyes meeting his. "Could you bring me another cup of coffee?" Nate asked, his tone casual yet deliberate. "I'll need a few refills to get through the day." Sophie blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the request. "Of course," she replied quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. As she stepped back into the room, her hands trembling slightly, Celeste let out an exasperated sigh. "Darling," she said, her voice edged with impatience, "why are you making such a fuss over something so trivial? If you're going to drink that much coffee, let me have the staff bring the carafe." Nate ignored her, his attention fixed on Sophie as she carefully refilled his cup. The delicate aroma of jasmine and bergamot filled the air again, stirring memories that left him both unsettled and certain. He watched her closely, noting the slight tremor in her hands and the way she avoided his gaze. "Thank you," he said softly, the warmth in his voice unmistakable. Sophie nodded quickly, murmuring, "You're welcome," before stepping away. Her heart pounded in her chest as she retreated, the weight of his gaze following her every step. She felt exposed, as if he could see through the layers of composure she had carefully constructed. Celeste shifted in her seat, her irritation barely masked. "Honestly, Nate, what's gotten into you?" she asked, her tone light but probing. "You're acting strange." Nate set his coffee cup down, leaning back in his chair as he regarded her with a measured expression. "Am I?" he said simply, his tone unreadable. "Yes," Celeste replied, her eyes narrowing slightly, "and I'd love to know why." For a moment Nate didn't respond. He let the silence stretch, his mind turning over the events of the past few days. When he finally spoke, his words were deliberate, each one carefully chosen. "It's just been a lot lately," he said, his voice low. "Plans falling apart, things not going the way I'd hoped. It's made me rethink a few things." Celeste frowned, confusion flickering across her face. "Like what?" Nate's gaze drifted toward the doorway, where Sophie had disappeared. His thoughts lingered on the quiet strength she had shown that night by the lake, the way she had been there when he needed someone most. "Like what really matters," he said finally, his tone carrying a weight that Celeste couldn't quite place. Sophie returned to the staff quarters, her steps hurried, as she tried to shake the unease that clung to her. She leaned against the wall, taking deep breaths to calm her racing heart. The way Nate had looked at her, spoken to her, it was as though he had seen through her, as though he knew. He can't know, she thought desperately. There's no way he could know. But the weight of his gaze and the certainty in his voice lingered, gnawing at her composure. She pushed off the wall and returned to her duties, determined to focus on the tasks at hand. Yet no matter how hard she tried, her thoughts kept circling back to him, to the kindness in his eyes, the warmth in his voice, the way he had defended her against Celeste's cruelty. By the time the sun began to set, Sophie was emotionally exhausted. She busied herself in the kitchen, preparing the table settings for dinner, when one of the other staff members approached her. "Sophie," the woman said, her tone curious, "Mr. Sawyer asked for you specifically. He's waiting in the library." Sophie froze, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Did he say why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman shook her head. "No, just that he needed to speak with you." Sophie swallowed hard, her stomach twisting into knots. She nodded slowly and made her way to the library, her steps hesitant and heavy with dread. When she reached the door, she paused, taking a deep breath before knocking softly. "Come in," came Nate's voice, calm and steady. Sophie pushed the door open, stepping inside. The library was dimly lit, the warm glow of the fireplace casting long shadows across the shelves of books. Nate stood by the window, his hands in his pockets, as he stared out at the darkening sky. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Sawyer?" Sophie said, her voice tentative. He turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "I did. Thank you for coming." Sophie nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "How can I help you?" Nate regarded her for a moment, his eyes searching hers. "I wanted to ask you something," he said finally, his tone gentle but firm. "That night by the lake? It was you, wasn't it?" Sophie's breath caught, her heart hammering in her chest. Her mind raced for an answer, but the truth was written plainly on her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. "It was you," Nate said again, his voice soft but certain. "I knew it." Sophie stood rooted to the spot, her pulse pounding in her ears. Nate's words echoed in the quiet room, each one peeling back the layers of her carefully guarded secret. She tried to respond, to deflect, but her voice betrayed her, trembling with unspoken truth. She started, her hands twisting nervously. "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Sawyer." Nate took a step closer, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Sophie," he said gently, "don't deny it." The jasmine and bergamot, your voice, the way you cared for me that night. It all makes sense now. Her shoulders sagged as the weight of his realization pressed down on her. There was no use pretending anymore. The truth, fragile as it was, had already escaped. Yes, she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. It was me. For a moment Nate said nothing, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be grappling with the gravity of her confession, his mind replaying the fragments of that night in a new light. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with both gratitude and something deeper, something Sophie couldn't quite place. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his tone tinged with a quiet intensity. "Why let me think it was someone else?" Sophie's gaze dropped to the floor, shame washing over her. "Because it wasn't my place," she said, her voice trembling. "You thought it was her, and I didn't want to take that away from you." Nate's brows furrowed, his confusion evident. "Take what away?" She hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "Your vision of who she is," she said finally, the words bitter on her tongue. "I didn't want to ruin that for you." Nate shook his head, a faint, incredulous smile tugging at his lips. "Sophie," he said, his voice softer now, "you didn't ruin anything. If anything, you showed me what I've been blind to all along." Her eyes flicked up to meet his, searching for the meaning behind his words. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking. "I mean," he said, his voice steady, "that you were there for me when I needed someone most. Not because it was your job or because it benefited you in any way, but because you cared. And that means more to me than anything." Tears pricked at Sophie's eyes, her emotions threatening to spill over. She shook her head, her voice cracking as she spoke. "You don't mean that. You're just—" "I do," he interrupted, his tone firm, "and I'm tired of pretending otherwise." The weight of his words settled between them, heavy with significance. Sophie's chest tightened as she searched his face for any sign of hesitation, but there was none. His gaze was steady, his conviction clear. "But what about her?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "What about Celeste?" Nate's expression darkened, a flicker of frustration crossing his features. "That's what I've been trying to figure out," he admitted. I thought she was the one, but now I'm not so sure." Sophie's heart ached at the pain in his voice, the uncertainty that clouded his usually confident demeanor. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay, but she couldn't bring herself to say the words. Instead, she took a small step back, putting some distance between them. "You should figure that out first," she said softly, her voice steady, despite the storm raging inside her, "before anything else." Nate hesitated, his expression conflicted. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're right," he said finally, his voice low. "I owe you that much." The room fell into a heavy silence, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Sophie took another step back, her hands trembling as she reached for the door. "Good night, Mr. Sawyer," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. Nate watched her go, his chest tightening as the door closed behind her. The library, once warm and inviting, now felt hollow and cold. He sank into the nearest chair, his mind spinning with thoughts of Sophie, Celeste, and the undeniable truth that had begun to take root in his heart. Sophie returned to her quarters, her mind racing with the events of the evening. She pressed her back against the closed door, her hands shaking as she clutched the fabric of her apron. She had finally told him the truth, or rather, he had uncovered it. And the weight of that revelation left her reeling. What happens now, she wondered, her chest aching with a mix of fear and hope. The days that followed were a blur of routine and tension. Sophie did her best to avoid Nate, but their paths inevitably crossed. Each time she felt the weight of his gaze, the unspoken questions lingering between them. Celeste, oblivious to the growing distance between herself and Nate, continued to dominate the household with her sharp commands and air of entitlement. It wasn't until a quiet evening, as Sophie was finishing her tasks in the kitchen, that she found herself face to face with Nate once more. He entered the room unexpectedly, his presence filling the space as he leaned casually against the counter. "Sophie," he said, his voice calm but insistent. She turned slowly, her heart racing as their eyes met. "Mr. Sawyer," she replied, her tone carefully neutral. "Is there something you need?" He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said finally. "I need you to stop avoiding me." Her breath caught, her chest tightening as she tried to form a response. "I'm not—" "You are," he interrupted gently but firmly, "and I understand why. But we need to talk." Sophie hesitated, her mind warring with itself. Part of her wanted to flee, to avoid the confrontation entirely, but another part, the part that had grown stronger since that night by the lake, urged her to stay. "Okay," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want to talk about?" Nate straightened, his gaze softening as he stepped closer. "That night," he began, his tone steady. "It wasn't just coincidence, was it? You were there for a reason." She nodded slowly, her throat tightening. "Yes," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Because you needed someone, and I couldn't leave you like that." The sincerity in her words struck him, his chest tightening as he took in her quiet strength. "You saved me," he said simply, his voice heavy with emotion, "in more ways than one." Sophie shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't do anything special," she whispered. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Nate said firmly, his voice unwavering. "Not anyone. You." Sophie felt her cheeks flush at the intensity of Nate's words. She wanted to look away, to escape the vulnerability in his gaze, but something kept her rooted in place. His presence, steady and unyielding, seemed to pull her closer, even as her instincts screamed at her to retreat. "You don't understand," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I couldn't stand the thought of you being alone." "And I wasn't," Nate said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that made her chest ache. "Because of you." The simplicity of his statement unraveled something inside her. She had spent so much of her life trying to stay invisible, to blend into the background, that hearing her actions recognized and valued felt almost surreal. Tears pricked at her eyes, and she quickly blinked them away, unwilling to let her emotions spill over. "This is complicated," she murmured, her hands twisting nervously. You're engaged, Mr. Sawyer." "Don't," Nate interrupted gently, his tone firm but kind. "Don't call me that, not after everything." Sophie hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. "Nate," she said finally, the name feeling strange yet intimate on her lips. "This doesn't change anything." He tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady and thoughtful. "It changes everything," he said quietly. "Or at least, it should." Sophie shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. "You don't mean that," she said, her voice laced with doubt. "You're just caught up in the moment." "Do you really believe that?" he asked, stepping closer. His eyes searched hers as if trying to read the truth in her expression. "Because I don't." Sophie's breath hitched, her chest tightening, as the distance between them diminished. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, the quiet intensity in his gaze drawing her in, but the weight of reality bore down on her, anchoring her in place. "You're engaged," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, "and I'm just—" "You're not just anything," Nate interrupted, his voice firm. "You're kind and brave and—" "Enough," Sophie said suddenly, her voice breaking. She stepped back, shaking her head as tears threatened to spill over. "This isn't fair, Nate. To me, to you, to her." Nate's shoulders sagged, his expression pained. "You're right," he admitted, his voice low. "It's not fair, but it's the truth." Sophie inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself. "Then do what's fair," she said softly, her voice trembling but resolute. "Figure out what you want, what you really want, and when you do, maybe then we can talk." Her words hung in the air, a quiet challenge that left Nate momentarily speechless. He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "You deserve more than this," he said finally, his voice heavy with emotion. "And I'm going to make sure you get it." Sophie swallowed hard, the weight of his promise pressing against her heart. She forced a small, trembling smile before stepping away. "Good night, Nate," she said softly, her voice barely audible, as she turned and left the kitchen. As Sophie closed the kitchen door behind her, the weight of the evening pressed heavily on her chest. She returned to her quarters once again, her thoughts a turbulent mix of fear, hope, and uncertainty. Nate's words had been sincere, almost painfully so, but they left her standing on the edge of a precipice she wasn't sure she was ready to leap from. In the quiet of her room, Sophie stared out the small window overlooking the estate gardens. She had always found solace in her role here, blending into the rhythm of a world she wasn't truly part of. But Nate had unraveled that comfort, showing her that she mattered in ways she had never dared to imagine. Meanwhile, in his own quarters, Nate sat alone, replaying her parting words in his mind. "Figure out what you want." He had already begun that journey, but Sophie's challenge solidified his resolve. He couldn't continue living a life dictated by expectations and appearances. He had to be honest with himself, with Sophie, and with Celeste. Over the next few weeks, the house seemed to hum with change. Celeste's presence grew distant as her frustrations with Nate became more apparent. She retreated into her social calendar, leaving Nate to reflect on the hollow foundation of their relationship. The conversations they had were few and strained, each one pulling them further apart. Sophie, too, felt the shift in the air. Though she and Nate exchanged few words, their glances carried the weight of everything unspoken. She couldn't deny the spark between them, but the fear of hope kept her guarded. Still, she began to wonder, what if he means it? What if we could be something more? One late afternoon, Nate found Sophie in the greenhouse again, her hands tending to the orchids. She turned as he entered, her breath catching at the quiet determination in his expression. "Sophie," he said, his voice steady, "I've made my decision." She froze, her heart pounding. "And?" Nate stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "It's you," he said simply. "It's always been you. I just didn't realize it until now." Tears welled in Sophie's eyes, her chest aching with both hope and fear. "Nate," she whispered, her voice trembling, "this isn't just about what you want. This is about whether we can find a way to make this work." "We can," Nate said firmly, his voice full of conviction. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I'll fight for you, Sophie, if you'll let me." Sophie's heart soared, and for the first time she let herself believe in the possibility of a future with him. Her lips curved into a small, tentative smile as she whispered, "Then let's figure it out together." Nate reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady, and in that moment the weight of the past began to fall away. Together they stepped into the unknown, ready to embrace the beauty of a love that had grown quietly, like the orchids Sophie so carefully nurtured. For the first time in a long time, both of them felt free.